I'm going to start this video with a few photos because I didn't record what I did at the beginning of the project. So to start here, I've got a piece of brass round bar which I've glued to a piece of rosewood, and then I mounted that in the lathe and started to shape the head of the marking gauge. And then next I made a little brass round button which sits at the bottom of the head of the marking gauge. And I took that over to the pillar drill and I drilled through the brass button through the rosewood, and later I'll put a bolt through these holes and that will hold the head of the marking gauge together. Here I drilled and tapped the head of the marking gauge to accept the brass locking thumb screw. I'm just making the micro adjuster for the mitre gauge, and what I've got here is a piece of brass which I've nailed, and I'm running a thread internally here, and this is the main shaft of the marking gauge. So that's going to thread onto here, and then this piece will be split in two to form the micro adjuster. What I'm doing here is making the scribing piece for the marking gauge. So I'm just putting the bevel on it and machining that down to a fine edge, and then I'll drill a hole in the centre. This is the scribing wheel that I was making earlier, and like I said, I made it out of stainless steel, and what I want to try and do is heat treat it to harden it. So I'll heat it up to cherry red and then quench it in oil, but I'm not sure if you can heat treat stainless steel in the same way as tool steel, and unfortunately I don't know what kind of stainless steel this is. It was just an odd piece I had lying around, but I'll give it a go anyway and see what it comes out like. So I've just heated that up to cherry red and quenched it in the oil, and I've just file tested in it. It seems to be fairly hard. So there's the finished cutting spur. All I've got to do now is just give it a sharpen up on a diamond stone. I'm just working on the head of the marking gauge now, so what I've done is just held it together with a bolt and a drill bit here, and you can see these three holes run right the way through and stop about here. So what I've got to do now is tap these holes to accept a bolt that will run right the way through the two brass sections and the rosewood, and then that bolt will hold it all together. Right, I've threaded the holes here now. I just did it on the pillar drill just to make sure I was going down square. And I've drilled through the brass end cap and the rosewood, and I've just countersunk there for the heads of the bolts. So the bolt will go through here and through the rosewood, and then it will thread into the holes here, and that locks it all together. And I'm just going to use a bit of epoxy, a bit of Aldite to sandwich it all together, and then once the epoxy's gone off, I'll put it back onto the lathe and just final finish it, just clean it up, clean all the little marks off. What I'm working on here is the main shaft of the marking gauge, and it's a piece of stainless steel tubing with another piece of stainless steel rods inserted into the centre. And back here I've made these two thumb screws, and this rear thumb screw gets fixed to the inner rod, and this one works up and down the outer rod like this. And what I've got to do, what I've done here, is machine the end slightly smaller so it fits into this hole. And what I'll do is I'll pin this permanently on here, and then when you want to make a micro adjustment on the marking gauge, you've got about 10 to 12 mil of micro adjustment. So as you wind this back thumb screw, it advances this main rod out here. And then once you're happy with the position of it, you twist this front thumb screw back, and that locks the two together. So the main adjustment obviously to do with the head of the marking gauge, and then any micro adjustment within 10 mil you can do back here. So that's how that works. And like I say, the next job I've got to do is just to cut this down a little bit and then pin it onto this brass thumb screw, and that will lock that in position. Right, I've cut this rod down now, and I'm just going to try pinning the brass thumb wheel onto the rod. I've got it clamped in the brass really tight. I'm not going too mad here because I don't want to risk slipping off and hitting the brass. But it has pinched it tight, which is what I was hoping for. So that has pinched it tight. And what I'm going to do now is just check it back on the rod and grind away some of this surplus and come back and pin it a little bit more. Right, I've finished the main body of the marking gauge now. I've got it glued and bolted together, so it's all nice and solid, and I put it back onto the lathe and I final finished it. And what I'm going to do now is just give it a few coats of raw linseed oil. Linseed oil is a lovely finish for darker woods, and it's great for hand tools as well because it doesn't chip like lacquer would. So yeah, I'll just give it a few coats of that. And I've shortened this thumb screw as well, which goes in here. So now when you tighten it up against the bar or the rod, it sits nice and flush there. I'm just applying it with some 4-0 wire wool. And what I'll do now is just leave that to soak in for half an hour or so, and then I'll buff it off with a rag and then give it another few coats. What I've got here is a piece of float glass with some wet and dry sandpaper on top, and I'm just removing some of the fine scratches that were left from the machining. And the same thing for the end of the brass rod. So the marking gauge is pretty much done now. All I've got to do is disassemble everything and give it a good clean up, get all the grime off, and then I can reassemble it and give it a try. I'm carrying on working on the box for the marking gauge, and you can see I've got it glued up here. And what I've made here, this is some bird's eye maple and a walnut veneer, and I've laminated them together to make this shape that follows the shape of the box. So then this lining sits inside the box, and I've got some mould which holds it in place. And here's the top of the box that I've done. So what I've made here is some little dovetail bows, and I'm going to inlet them into the end of the box like this, because this is end grain and I've just glued the end on. It will give it a little bit of extra strength. So what I've done here is just super glued that bow on, just so I can knife around it a little bit easier without it moving. And I should just carefully prise that back off again. I can see my knife lines there. What I've got here is a little trimmer router with a little 2-3mm cutter. And I've set the depth up so it's the same as the bow. And like I said, I've taken the worst of the material away, and now I can just chisel this down to the lines. Being really careful just to cut to my knife lines. So these are for decoration as well, but they are serving a bit of a purpose. So keeping the end of the box in place. the glue should do a fairly decent job. I mean, gluing end grain isn't really something you should be doing, but for the purpose here it's not so bad. And ideally with anything like this you want to try and get a first time fit if possible, as the more times you put in and remove this, cause the fibres to crush, and there's a chance that pieces will start breaking off. But that looks as if it's going to fit nicely. So I'll put a bit of glue on. Just tap it home. That's one down, 7 more to go. I've given the box a couple of coats of lacquer, and I've very gently cut it back with 400 grit sandpaper, and now I'm just going to apply some wax to give it a nice shine. Right, it's been 10 minutes or so, and I've buffed the wax off with a microfiber cloth, so that's all looking nice. And I've polished up the brass bits just with a bit of Brasso, so I can start assembling the box now. I'm just going to put these hinges on with one screw at the moment. And once I get the lid fixed on, I'll fit the last screws and line the heads up. Just want to Make sure it's all sitting nicely first before putting the other screws in. The marking gauge is finally done. So for the box I used walnut with some maple dovetail bows for decoration. And then looking inside, I've got some bird's eye maple box liners. The marking gauge itself is made from brass and stainless steel. This piece here I've put on a magnet, and it just locates in the end of the box here, and it just stops the marking gauge from moving around inside the box. So to take the marking gauge out, you just remove that, and then the marking gauge just comes free from the clasps. I've been using the marking gauge for a couple of weeks now, and I have to say I'm really pleased with how it turned out. It gives a lovely fine line, so it's excellent for detailed work, for cutting in small hinges. I actually used it to cut the hinges in for this box. When you compare it to a traditional marking gauge with a pin style marker, obviously this gives a much heavier line. So all in all, very pleased with it, with how it turned out. It's got a lovely weight to it as well. And the micro adjuster on the end here for making fine adjustments. And to put it back in the box, just pushes into the clasps, and then the magnetic piece just slips over the end, and the box closes with these little magnets here. These are 4mm magnets, one in each corner, just to close the box.